All right, so buckle up because today we're going deep on a concept that's going to turn everything you thought you knew about money upside down. We're talking denationalization.
Yeah, what if governments didn't have a monopoly on money?
Like, what if instead of dollars or euros or yen, you had a whole bunch of different currencies competing with each other, like ducats or florins or even like talents, all vying for your attention right there in your digital wallet?
That's the idea we're diving into today. It's based on the work of the economist F.A. Hayek. Specifically, we're looking at a few of his publications from the Institute of Economic Affairs. Hayek argued really passionately for a system of competing private currencies.
It sounds a little like science fiction. I mean, it makes you wonder, like, how did he even come up with this?
Well, Hayek was convinced that history shows us exactly why we need to rethink this whole idea of government control of money.
Yeah.
I mean, governments have a really long track record of manipulating currencies, just to benefit themselves.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We all know that feeling when, like, prices keep going up and your money just buys less and less every month. But how did that sort of thing play out historically? Can you give us an example?
Think about the Roman Empire. Those emperors would shave off bits of gold from the coins, and then they'd use that gold to mint more coins, effectively devaluing the currency.
Oh, wow. So they were basically just printing more money. Sounds kind of familiar.
Right. It's funny how these age-old tactics are basically a mirror to a lot of modern anxieties about inflation.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So it sounds like Hayek saw denationalization as a way to break that cycle, to take the power away from governments and put it back into the hands of the people.
Exactly. It's like the ultimate check and balance. Instead of blindly trusting a single authority, you would have the power to choose the currency that you trust the most.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty here. How did Hayek envision this whole thing actually working?
Well, the key, according to Hayek, was competition. He imagined private institutions issuing currencies that would be backed by tangible assets. So like you could have a ducat that's pegged to a basket of raw materials, oil, gold, maybe even wheat. So you could literally choose between different brands of money.
Hold on, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So instead of a central bank like we have now, you'd have all these banks competing for our business, trying to offer the most stable and trustworthy currencies.
That's exactly right. Their success would completely depend on maintaining public trust. So if people lose faith in their ducats, they just switch to a competitor offering more stable florin.
Wow. Okay, that makes sense. But wouldn't that just be total chaos? I mean, imagine trying to navigate a world with like hundreds of different currencies, constantly fluctuating exchange rates.
That's a common concern. But Hayek actually argued that those legal tender laws, the ones that force you to accept a specific currency, they're not really essential for a monetary system to actually function.
Wait, so you're telling me we wouldn't even need laws to tell us which currency to use?
He pointed to 19th century China as an example. Private paper money was thriving there, not because the government said so, but because people actually accepted it based on the issuer's reputation.
So it was all about trust, almost like a natural selection process for currencies.
You got it. The most stable and trustworthy ones would rise to the top naturally, even without any government intervention.
And how would these private institutions actually manage their currencies?
They'd have to be really sophisticated about it. Think like real-time data analysis, using algorithms to adjust the supply and maintain stability.
So it'd be a constant balancing act to keep their currency attractive.
Exactly.
I'm starting to see how this could work. But how would this play out in everyday life? Would I be walking around with a pocket full of different coins?
Well, maybe not coins.
Yeah.
But you bring up a good point. How would this system actually work in practice?
Yeah. And what impact would it have on everyday transactions? Things like wages, or even the emergence of whole new currency zones.
That's what we'll be getting into in the next part of our deep dive.
All right. I can't wait to hear more. So
Okay.
we spent the last part talking about Hayek's idea for like a system of competing currencies. But I'm still kind of stuck on like how this would actually function, in the real world. Would we all be walking around with like wallets full of different currencies?
That's a good question. It's easy to picture this whole system as like super chaotic and confusing. But Hayek believed that market forces would basically streamline things over time. Even if we start with like a ton of different currencies, competition would eventually lead to a handful of dominant ones.
Okay, so instead of needing like a wallet bursting with all kinds of money, we might just end up with like a few globally recognized, really trusted options. Exactly. It's like the evolution of any industry. You start with a bunch of different choices. And over time, the most efficient, the most reliable options, those are the ones that rise to the top. Just like how the gold standard, once provided a common reference point for global trade. These new dominant currencies could serve a similar purpose. They would likely be backed by stable commodity baskets, which would make cross-border transactions much smoother.
All right, so maybe the system wouldn't be as chaotic as we might think, but what about like just the average person, trying to buy groceries? How would they navigate this system?
Well, Hayek believed that people would naturally choose the currencies that best met their needs. The currencies that offered the most stability. Imagine checking your financial app and seeing like a list of available currencies with their real-time trust scores based on their track record of maintaining a stable purchasing power.
So like choosing a credit card with the best rewards program or picking a bank with the lowest fees. We'd all become like super savvy currency shoppers. Yeah, exactly. Consumers would have the power to make informed choices based on clarity, transparency, and the issuer's reputation. And this constant pressure from consumers would force those private currency issuers to stay honest and efficient.
It's a pretty compelling argument for individual empowerment.
Yeah.
But wouldn't some people be at a disadvantage in the system? What about people who aren't as tech savvy or people who don't have access to like all those financial tools?
That's a valid concern for sure. And it's one that would definitely need to be addressed to ensure, fairness and accessibility for everyone. Just like with any new technology, there would need to be a focus on education and support to help people adapt to this new financial landscape.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's talk about wages. Would employers start paying their employees in like multiple currencies?
It's likely that employers would offer wages in the currency that best aligns with their industry, or even with preferences of their employees. So, for example, like a tech company might pay salaries in a digital ducat, one that's known for its stability in the digital economy. Whereas like a global mining corporation might opt for a currency that's pegged to a basket of industrial metals.
So we could see a much more specialized and dynamic system, one that actually reflects the needs of different sectors.
Exactly. And this brings us to another really fascinating aspect of Hayek's proposal, the potential for distinct currency zones to emerge. He imagined groups of individuals and businesses with shared economic interests naturally gravitating towards using the same currency.
Currency zones. Can you give us an example of what that might look like?
Yeah, so imagine like Silicon Valley having its own currency zone, centered around that tech-focused digital ducat we were just talking about. And then like the Middle East might have a currency pegged to oil and natural gas. These zones wouldn't be determined by governments. They would emerge organically based on market forces and shared trust.
It's almost like different ecosystems developing with currencies specifically tailored to their needs. But with all these different currencies and zones, wouldn't there be a risk of like fraud or instability or even monopolies forming?
Oh, those are all valid concerns, definitely. And it's important to remember that Hayek wasn't saying there should be no regulation at all. He still believed in having a strong legal framework to prevent fraud and ensure fair competition.
So it sounds like the government's role would shift. Instead of controlling the money, they'd be more focused on ensuring the integrity of the market for money.
Precisely. It's kind of like a referee instead of a player.
I like that analogy. But, even with government oversight in the current system, we've still seen plenty of financial crises, like the 2008 financial crisis. That's a pretty stark reminder that centralized control doesn't automatically equal stability.
Very true.
So what would make this denationalized system any less susceptible to those kinds of problems?
Hayek believed that competition itself would be the most effective safeguard. In a free market for money issuers who fail to maintain stability or engage in shady practices, they would be abandoned by users pretty quickly.
So it's that classic idea that the fear of losing customers is a really powerful incentive for businesses to behave themselves.
Exactly. Just as consumers have learned to distinguish between reliable and unreliable products in other industries, they would develop a similar awareness when choosing currencies.
So you're saying we'd all need to become a bit more financially literate. We'd need to really pay attention to the track record of these different currency issuers.
Absolutely. The collective wisdom of the crowd would act as like a powerful market force, weeding out bad actors and rewarding those who maintain stability and transparency.
Okay, I'm starting to see how the system could potentially be more resilient than what we have now. But what about things like government spending and taxation? If governments no longer control the money supply, how would they fund their operations?
That's a really crucial question. And Hayek actually addressed that head on. He believed that in a denationalized system, governments would need to return to a principle of fiscal responsibility, balancing their budgets and funding their activities primarily through taxation.
So no more just printing money to cover massive deficits.
Well, Hayek acknowledged that governments would still be able to borrow money on the open market, just like any other entity. but they wouldn't have the power to manipulate interest rates or artificially inflate the currency to make their debts easier to repay.
So it's kind of like taking away the easy money button and forcing governments to actually live within their means. That
Exactly.
would be a pretty big shift. Now, you mentioned that Hayek wasn't the first to propose ideas along these lines. Can you tell us a bit more about like the historical context for his work?
Sure, Hayek was actually building on a long tradition of thought about free banking that emerged in the 19th century. This movement advocated for competition in the banking sector, particularly allowing private banks to issue their own banknotes.
Free banking, I've heard of that.
Yeah, so it's kind of a step towards Hayek's ideas. But with one key difference, the focus back then was on banknotes that were redeemable in gold or silver, not entirely distinct currencies like Hayek proposed.
So Hayek was arguing that we needed to go further and completely rethink the role of government in the monetary system.
Exactly. He was challenging a system that had been in place for decades, arguing that it was inherently unstable and prone to abuse, especially because of fractional reserve banking.
Now, for those of us who might not be familiar with that term, can you explain what fractional reserve banking is and why Hayek saw it as problematic?
Of course, so fractional reserve banking is basically a system where banks lend out more money than they actually have in reserves. It's a way of creating money. But Hayek believed it created a system that was really vulnerable to these cycles of booms and busts, especially when you combine it with government manipulation of the money supply.
So he saw competing currencies as a way to break free from that cycle and give individuals more control over their own financial well-being. It's a pretty radical vision. It definitely challenges a lot of deeply held beliefs about money. But how would we even begin to implement such a drastic change? Could we actually transition to this world of denationalized money?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And that's what we'll be exploring in the final part of our deep dive. We'll delve into the potential challenges and opportunities of making such a radical shift in our monetary system.
So we've spent the last two parts of this deep dive like really digging into Hayek's vision of a world with denationalized money. But how do we actually get there from here? Like how do we move from theory to reality?
That's the big question, right? Even if we assume like everyone's on board with this idea, which is a big assumption, the transition would be incredibly complex.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I mean, think about it. We're talking about rewriting contracts, updating accounting systems, retraining whole industries. It'd be a massive undertaking.
Yeah, it sounds pretty overwhelming. And let's be realistic here. There's going to be pushback. Governments, central banks, big financial institutions, they all benefit from the current system. I doubt they'd give up control that easily.
Oh, absolutely. You're talking about some seriously powerful interests. They're not going to go down without a fight. It's easy to talk about ideal systems in theory, but the real world, those power dynamics are a whole different beast.
So are we just stuck then? Is Hayek's vision just destined to be like an academic thought experiment? Because I got to say, there's a part of me that's really drawn to this idea of like more individual choice and control when it comes to money.
I get that. And while a complete overhaul of the global monetary system might seem like a pipe dream, Hayek's work still has a lot to teach us. There are valuable lessons we can apply even within the existing framework.
Okay, so we don't need to like throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Exactly.
What kind of lessons are we talking about?
Well, Hayek's work really underscores the importance of competition and choice. Even if we can't completely eliminate government involvement in money, we can still push for greater transparency, accountability, and options for individuals.
So things like promoting alternative payment systems, maybe exploring new technologies like cryptocurrencies, or even just demanding more clarity from central banks about their policies.
Exactly. Every step towards greater transparency and individual empowerment, it chips away at that government monopoly on money. And it forces those in power to be more responsive to the needs of everyday people.
So we're talking about planting seeds for change, even if we don't see the full impact of those efforts for years to come.
Right. Those small changes can really add up over time. And Hayek's work also challenges us to think differently about the nature of money itself. Is it just a tool for government control, or should it be a neutral medium of exchange that allows for free and voluntary interactions between people?
That's a really big question. It's something I think everyone listening should really consider. What kind of monetary system do we want? What role should governments play? Do we prioritize stability or freedom or innovation?
You got it. We're not just passive recipients of this system. We have a voice, and our choices matter. Even if a world of competing currencies seems far off, we can still advocate for greater transparency, accountability, and ultimately a system that serves the needs of individuals, not just the interests of the powerful.
It's kind of empowering to think that we're not completely powerless in the system. We can demand better, and we can make choices that reflect our values.
That's the heart of Hayek's message. It's a call to action, not just for economists and policymakers, but for each of us to really engage in this critical dialogue about the future of money. The choices we make today will shape the financial landscape for generations to come.
That's a powerful thought. The idea of a fully denationalized monetary system might seem pretty far-fetched, but the principles behind it, freedom, competition, individual choice, those are timeless values worth fighting for, even within the system we have right now. So keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a more equitable financial system.
That's what a true deep dive is all about. Take the information, think about the possibilities, and never stop questioning the status quo.